In 1917, officials inside the imperial treasury of the Ottoman Empire confronted a realization that could not be solved with a decree, a reform committee, or even a favorable end to the war, because the empire no longer possessed the financial capacity required to sustain the political, military, and administrative system it had spent centuries constructing. The Ottoman state still controlled vast territory, commanded large, standing armies, and carried the institutional authority of a long-lived empire, yet the financial structure beneath that power had already been hollowed out, leaving a system that appeared formidable from the outside, while steadily losing its ability to support itself from within. 2 decades later, leaders responsible for governing the British Empire arrived at a strikingly similar conclusion under circumstances that looked very different on the surface. Because Britain had technically won the war, still issued the world's dominant currency, and still sat at the center of global finance, yet could no longer afford the political, military, and social obligations required to maintain a global empire that had expanded far beyond its economic base. And in 1989, planners inside the Soviet Union were finally forced to acknowledge what decades of flawless production statistics and carefully managed reports had concealed, which was that the system functioned convincingly on paper while failing almost everywhere it actually mattered in reality. Each of these empires appeared stable, dominant, and powerful right up until the moment they failed, and when that failure arrived, it felt abrupt, dramatic, and difficult to explain to the people living through it. But that sense of suddenness is misleading, because long before collapse becomes visible, a quieter and far more consequential process is already underway, as a structural pattern unfolds beneath the surface, tightening constraints, removing flexibility, and leaving power standing without the institutional support required to hold it up. That distinction matters because history consistently trains us to search for dramatic causes, when in reality, empires rarely fail because of a single event, a single decision, or a single leader acting badly at the wrong moment. They fail because the systems that support power lose their ability to adapt. Across centuries, cultures, ideologies, and technologies, empires do not fall randomly. They fail in stages, and once those stages begin, collapse becomes a question of timing rather than surprise. The first stage begins with success. Empires expand territorially, militarily, and administratively, and for a long time, that expansion looks indistinguishable from strength as new regions are absorbed, trade networks widen, institutions grow larger, and revenues increase in ways that seem to confirm the system is working exactly as intended. But expansion also introduces a structural tension that rarely receives attention at the time. As empires grow, complexity increases faster than institutions can adapt to manage it, and systems originally designed for smaller, more flexible states begin to stretch across vast territories without evolving at the same pace. Decision-making slows as authority centralizes, administrative layers multiply, and rules replace judgment in the name of consistency, creating a system that prioritizes uniformity over responsiveness. From inside the system, none of this feels like decline. It feels like professionalism, stability, and maturity. This is often remembered as the empire's golden age, precisely because the costs of rigidity have not yet surfaced, even though flexibility has already begun to disappear. The key feature of this stage is that the trade-off is invisible. Leaders believe they are building resilience through scale, when in reality, they are exchanging adaptability for control. And that exchange quietly sets the direction of everything that follows. The second stage begins when the costs of maintaining that scale finally outpace the system's ability to reform itself. Military commitments become more expensive, bureaucracies grow heavier, social obligations expand, and political promises accumulate faster than revenue can sustainably support them, creating a widening gap between responsibility and capacity. At this point, leadership faces a choice between restructuring incentives or preserving continuity, and history shows that continuity almost always wins, because reform is disruptive, politically costly, and destabilizing in the short term, Instead of changing the system, empires paper over strain through borrowing, monetary distortion, financial engineering, or accounting adjustments that preserve the appearance of stability without addressing the underlying imbalance. What makes this stage especially dangerous is not that these tools exist, but that they often work just well enough to delay consequences. Each successful deferral reinforces the belief that the system has survived stress rather than merely postponed it, training leadership to assume that the structure can absorb more pressure than it actually can. This is the point where failure becomes locked in. Nothing appears broken, daily life continues, and the empire still projects strength, but the options available to correct course quietly disappear. The third stage begins when legitimacy starts to erode. As fiscal and political margins tighten, persuasion gradually gives way to enforcement, and governance shifts from maintaining consent to managing compliance. Rules multiply, oversight expands, dissent is reframed as inefficiency or disloyalty, and political flexibility collapses as the system becomes increasingly focused on preserving control rather than adapting to reality. This transition is critical because legitimacy functions as a shock absorber, allowing systems to bend without breaking, while control does not. Once legitimacy is replaced by enforcement, the system loses its ability to self-correct, leaving it dependent on rigidity at the exact moment adaptability is most needed. At this stage, the system still functions, but it does so mechanically, without trust, and without the resilience that trust provides. From the inside, this often feels like order being restored. From the outside, it looks like stability. But structurally, it represents a system that has lost its capacity to respond to change without force. The fourth stage is where collapse finally becomes visible. A war, a fiscal rupture, a political crisis, or a reform that exposes reality instead of concealing it, delivers a shock that the system can no longer absorb. Not because the shock itself is extraordinary, but because the institutional structure beneath it has already been weakened beyond repair. This is why collapse appears fast. The speed is not the cause of failure. It is the consequence of decay that has already run its course, leaving no buffer, no elasticity, and no room for adjustment. What looks like a sudden fall is actually the final moment of a long structural process finally reaching the surface. When we place the Ottoman, British, and Soviet systems side by side, the similarities become impossible to dismiss. Because despite vast differences in ideology, culture, and historical context, each followed the same sequence from expansion to concealed strain to enforced control, and finally to rapid failure once stress could no longer be hidden. Different systems expressed the stages differently, but the order never changed. That consistency is the real lesson. Empires do not fall when power is challenged. They fall when flexibility disappears. And once flexibility is gone, collapse is no longer dramatic or chaotic. It is efficient. So the real question history leaves us with is not why empires fall, but why systems that appear powerful so often fail to recognize that the structure supporting their power has already been quietly emptied long before the end finally arrives. This is Money Margins. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.